This is Chapter 7, Founding a Nation. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at America under the Articles of Confederation, looking at the new Constitution, the debate over ratification, and the origin of the Bill of Rights, and really looking at this phrase, we the people. First thing we're going to be looking at are the achievements and the problems of the Confederation government. This is the government that was established during the War for Independence and was our first national government after the war. So during the Revolutionary era, Americans described their nation as a rising empire that would eventually control all of North America. America's empire would not be ruled by force, as the empires of Europe had been, and as Thomas Jefferson wrote, America would be an empire of liberty, cemented by a commitment to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The United States was already larger than Great Britain, Spain, and France combined, and it benefited from its isolation from war-torn Europe. Its young population and a broad distribution of property and literacy among whites. Yet, America did not control its vast western territories, which was populated by Indians and bordered by the British and the Spanish, who posed a military and commercial threat. The nation was also very rural. Its population was divided among varying ethnic and religious groups. No republic had ever been established in such a large area with such diverse people. The success and unity of the nation was very uncertain. The nation's first written constitution was the Articles of Confederation. This was drafted by Congress in 1777 and approved by the states in 1781. The Articles were the attempt to balance the national coordination that was needed to win the war against fears that centralized government power threatened liberty. With the Articles, the 13 states retained their own sovereignty. They retained their own right to rule. The national government was a one-house Congress in which each state only had one vote. There was no president that existed to enforce laws, and no judicial branch that existed to interpret the laws. The national government had only powers related to war, the power to declare war, conduct foreign relations. Congress could make money but could not impose taxes or regulate trade or business, and its revenue came from the voluntary contribution of the state governments, meaning any money that the national government had was money that the states voluntarily gave to them. Amendment to the Articles never received enough votes to pass because it had to be 100%. Although the Articles made a strong central government impossible, they did enable the states to surrender their disputed claims to Western lands and give them the federal government a major treatment. So settling these Western lands and creating these ordinances was a major success. You can see these Western lands in 1782 to 1802. These were the lands that were ceded by the states and were controlled public domain for the national government. This is the main achievement of the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. The national government, under the Articles, established rules for settling the enormous new national land that they had gained east of the Mississippi River. While Americans considered it empty, it was in fact inhabited by about 100,000 Indians. When Congress declared independence from Britain, it argued that the Indians had forfeited their rights to the land when they sided with the British. Now, despite the fact that only certain tribes had done so, the government secured from the Indians much of the land north of the Ohio River, but in the south left small parts of the land there to be held permanently by the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw tribes. This is going to become very important later on as Americans attempt to move westward after the Louisiana Purchase. Now, though many national leaders believed that the nation's prosperity depended on farmers gaining western land, others saw government land sales as a source of revenue, and some worried that it would cause a continual conflict with the Indians. Private land companies hoped to buy up the land and sell it to settlers at a huge profit. The war's end caused a huge number of Americans to migrate westward in upstate New York and what would become Kentucky and Tennessee. They believed that their right to take western lands was essential to American freedom. They ignored Indian land titles, demanded that the government sell or give away the land, and often settled lands to which they had no legal title. Many national leaders worried that these settlers were unruly, disorderly, and would incite war with the Indians, so they sought to regulate Western settlements. This is an engraving from the Farmer's and Mechanic's Almanac, shows farm families moving west along a primitive road. So we talk a little more about the land ordinances under the Articles of Confederation. In the 1780s, Congress regulated the way that Western land was sold and settled. The Land Ordinance of 1784, which was written by Thomas Jefferson, established the steps by which these areas would be governed. This measure divided the region into districts, first governed by Congress and eventually admitted into the Union of States. Congress rejected by a single vote a clause in which a bill would have prohibited slavery in the entire West. A 1785 ordinance regulated land sales in the region north of the Ohio River, which became known as the Old Northwest. This land was to be surveyed by the government and sold in sections for $1 per acre. This system was meant to control and concentrate settlement and to raise revenue for Congress, but settlers violated many of the rules by moving into areas where surveys had not been done. Initially, the minimum purchase required by the government was too large for individual farmers to pay. Much of the land was sold to large land companies and speculators, who then divided the land and sold it to settlers at a huge profit. This caused many Americans in coming decades to demand that the government provide free or cheap land. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 called for the eventual establishment of 3 to 5 states north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River. This ensured Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. The U.S. would not rule its territories as a colonial power, but allow these lands to become equal parts of the political system as self-governing states. Territorial expansion and self-government would grow together. This ordinance also recognized that Indians had a claim to lands in this area and promised not to take their land without consent. Yet, national land policy assumed that Indians would disappear as a result of purchase, treaties, or voluntary removal. The ordinance also prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest. You can see here in this map and the details of townships and sections and square miles. These were the series of ordinances in the 1780s that provided for surveying and sale of the lands in the public domain north of the Ohio River, and the eventual admission of states carved from the area as equal members of the Union. Many prominent Americans believed that the Articles of Confederation were irredeemably flawed. First in their minds was the nation's economic crisis in the 1780s. To finance the Revolutionary War, Congress had borrowed large sums of money, but without economic revenue, Congress was unable to pay the interest and the debts themselves. The British had barred American ships from trading with the West Indies, and European goods flooded the market, ruining the business of many artisans, drove down wages, and removed money from the country. So states adopted their own relief measures, printing more money, postponing debt collection, and creditors saw these laws as infringement on their property rights. In the late 1786 and early 1787, debt-ridden farmers closed courts in western Massachusetts in order to prevent seizure of their lands for failure to pay taxes. This revolt came to be known as Shays' Rebellion, after one of their leaders named Daniel Shays, who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. These rebels, in demanding relief and the printing of paper money, thought they were continuing the Revolution's tradition. An army organized by the Massachusetts government quelled the rebellion with very little violence, and the revolt convinced some influential Americans that a stronger national government was needed to encourage economic growth, to protect property, and to secure law and order. This is a bankruptcy scene showing creditors repossessing the belongings of a family that was unable to pay its debts, while a woman weeps in the background. This is a very popular fear of bankruptcy that led several states during the 1780s to pass laws postponing the collection of debt. One man who was very afraid of Democratic excess, James Madison, who was a Virginian and a student of Thomas Jefferson, led the movement to strengthen the national government. He was joined by Alexander Hamilton of New York, the most vocal advocate of a robust national government, who wanted to make the nation into a world military and commercial power. These nationalists found allies with others to whom the Revolution had given consciousness of the nation, such as army officers, members of Congress, and diplomats. Influential economic interests, such as bondholders who wanted Congress to be able to generate revenue in order to pay them back, and urban artisans who wanted tariff protection, joined with these afraid that the states were violating property rights to demand a stronger national government. In September of 1786, delegates from 6 states met at Annapolis, Maryland, this is the Annapolis Convention, in order to explore new ways to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. They proposed another gathering in Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation, and Shays' Rebellion stimulated support for this plan. Here we see James Madison in a miniature portrait from 1783. He was only 36 years old when the Constitutional Convention began, and he is considered to be the father of the United States Constitution. Here's Alexander Hamilton, another youthful leader. He was born in the West Indies in 1755, and the portrait was done in the 1790s. Now, this next section, we're going to be looking at the Constitutional Convention. What were the disagreements, the compromises, that molded this final Constitution, and what was its content. Many of the 35 men who met at the Constitutional Convention were very prominent individuals. This included George Washington, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Men of education and great wealth, they were, in their social status, highly unrepresentative of most Americans. They all shared a commitment to a stronger national government and believed that democracy had gone too far. They deliberated in private to ensure free and honest debate, and recordings of the proceedings were not published, by recordings we mean notes taken from the proceedings, were not published until 1840, after all of the delegates had died. All of the delegates agreed that there must be a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary in this new national government. The new Constitution would allow Congress to raise money through direct taxes without relying on the state governments for revenue. The federal government would represent the people too. Even the delegates who thought democracy had gone too far rejected Hamilton's proposal for a king and a House of Lords. Debate centered on how to balance federal, national, and state governments in the interests of small and large states. Madison's Virginia plan proposed the creation of a 2-house legislature, with the state's population determining its representation in each house. Smaller states, who feared domination by the more popular states, the larger ones, countered with the New Jersey plan, which called for a single-house Congress, where each state cast one vote. So a compromise formed a 2-house Congress. This is the Connecticut Compromise. This created a Senate, in which each state would have 2 members, and a House of Representatives where members were apportioned according to the state's population, meaning larger states would have more representatives, smaller states would have fewer. Senators would be chosen by the state legislatures, and this would somewhat insulate them or protect them from shifts in public opinion, and representatives would be elected every 2 years by the people directly. This is a $50 note that was issued by the Continental Congress during the War of Independence. Congress's inability to raise funds to repay such paper money like this in gold or silver was a major reason why the Nationalists desired a stronger federal government. This is the Philadelphia State House, which we now call Independence Hall. This is where the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and was where the Constitutional Convention took place in 1787. The direct election of members in the House of Representatives was, in fact, an expansion of democracy. But the government structure created by the Constitution represented a limitation on democracy overall. Delegates hoped to isolate the nation's government from popular sentiments that had alarmed the elites in the 1780s. They also wanted to ensure that the right kind of men were elected to office. While the people would remain sovereign, they would choose those who governed them from among the elite. They assumed that the Senate would be composed of each state's most prominent citizens and made the House of Representatives quite small, assuming that only very prominent men would win elections in large districts. Neither the president nor the federal judges would be elected directly. The president was to be chosen by the Electoral College or the House, and the electors were not voted upon directly either. The Electoral College was an indirect means to elect the president because the delegates did not trust ordinary voters to choose the president and vice president directly. The Constitution is actually quite brief and barely outlines the structure of the national government. It embodies two political principles, federalism, which is sometimes called the division of powers, and the system of checks and balances between different branches of the national government, also called the separation of powers. Federalism is the relationship between the national government and the states. The Constitution compared the articles strengthen national authority. It gave the president power to enforce the law and command the military. It gave Congress powers to impose taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, declare war, and deal with Indians and foreign nations to promote the general welfare for the people. States were barred from printing their own money or relieving debtors as they had done under the Articles. But the daily responsibilities of government, such as law enforcement and education, were left to the state. The separation of powers is the way that Congress designated or is designed in the Constitution to prevent any single branch of the national government from dominating the other two branches. Congress creates the laws, but the president can veto them. A two-thirds majority is needed to pass a law over his veto, however. The federal judges are nominated by the president, but have to be approved by Congress. However, they have a lifelong term in order to ensure their independence of either branch. The president can be impeached by the House and can be removed from office by the Senate. Now, slavery also sparked debate at the Constitutional Convention. Though the word slavery and slave did not appear in the Constitution, the Constitution affected slavery as an institution itself. It prohibited Congress from banning the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years. It required states to return fugitive slaves to their owners, and it did stipulate that 3/5 of the slave population would be counted in determining each state's representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Many of these measures were proposed by delegates from South Carolina who were fiercely pro-slavery. Now, these compromises about slavery made it more central to American politics and life than it had ever been before. The Constitution allowed the importation of slaves to continue until 1808, when Congress then prohibited it. But by then, 170,000 more slaves have been brought to the United States, more than 1/4 of all slaves carried into the country since 1700. The Fugitive Slave Clause gave slavery extraterritoriality. Slavery was a legal condition and remained the status of an individual slave, even if that individual entered a free state where slavery had been abolished. The Constitution did not give the national government any authority to interfere with slavery in the states. The 3/5 Clause also gave the white South far more power in national affairs than its free population really warranted, allowing it to dominate the House of Representatives and ensure that every president but 4 elected between 1788 and 1848 was a Southern slaveholder. You see here, this is an advertisement for the sale of 100 slaves from Virginia to states further south that appeared in a Richmond newspaper just a few months after signing the Constitution. Slavery, again, a major subject of debate at the Constitutional Convention. Now, once the delegates approved the final document, it was sent to the states to be ratified. The Constitution established a new framework for American development, and able national market to develop by giving Congress power over tariffs, interstate commerce, the coinage of money, patents, bankruptcy rules, and prohibiting interference with property rights. You see here, this is a very famous painting by Thomas Rossiter, and it shows the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Among the founding fathers depicted are James Wilson, who is signing the document at the table at the center, and George Washington, who presided from the dais, which is the image of the sun behind him. Here is the preamble to the Constitution, which outlines the purposes of our government that will be shown in the Constitution. And this is printed in a Pennsylvania newspaper just days after the Constitutional Convention had adjourned. Now this is an engraving by Amos Doolittle. Shows some of the debates over ratification of the Constitution. Okay. The wagon in the center is carrying Connecticut and is sinking into the mud under the weight of debt and paper money as federals and anti-federals try to pull it out. Federals are calling for the states to comply with Congress, that is, to pay the money asked of it to the national government. The anti-federalists reply tax luxury and its success to Shays as a reference to Shays' rebellion. The Connecticut shoreline and the buildings of Manhattan are on the right. Underneath the three merchant ships, the phrases criticizing tariffs that states were imposing on imports from one another, which the Constitution later prohibited. At the bottom is the biblical motto, "A house divided itself against itself cannot stand." This is, again, later made more famous by Abraham Lincoln. Now, looking at the debate over ratification and the origin of the Bill of Rights, we're going to see how the Anti-Federalist concerns raised during ratification really led to the creation of a Bill of Rights. Now, even though the Constitution provided that it would go into effect when 9 states approved it, not all 13, as the Articles of Confederation would require, ratification was not certain. Each state held an election for delegates to a special statewide ratifying convention, and those elections generated intense activity. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay authored a series of 85 essays that appeared as The Federalist in 1788. These three argued that the Constitution did not endanger, but in fact protected Americans' liberties. Madison, especially in essays numbered 10 and 51, developed a new vision of the relationship between government and society in the United States. Madison identified the basic dilemma of the new republic. Government must be based on the will of the people, but the people were susceptible to dangerous opinions, especially those that might threaten property rights. He worried that a growing number of poor in the future might use their political power to secure a more equal distribution of wealth. The solution, Madison said, was to be found in the republic's size and diversity. Previous republics had always been small in size, but the size of America, he argued, would stabilize, not weaken its government. In a nation so large, many distinct interests would develop so that no single interest would ever be able to take over the government and dominate the others. Every majority would be a coalition of minorities, which would then secure the rights of individuals. Madison reassured Americans that they had only to extend the sphere to ensure that the republics would continue under the Constitution. Madison strengthened the idea that westward expansion was essential to American freedom, made the structure of government and its size, not virtue, the basis of republicanism, and advanced the liberal notion that men are motivated by self-interest and that social good emerges from conflict between private interests. Here we see New York's Grand Federal Procession of 1788, which was celebrating the ratification of the Constitution. Members of each trade and occupation marched together, so it's a parade. And this document illustrates the variety of crafts in pre-industrial society. Here's the rest of this previously. Those opposing ratification were called anti-federalists. They believed that the Constitution favored power more than it did freedom. They were poorly organized, and they included many of the farmers who sought economic relief in the 1780s. Anti-Federalists predicted that this new government would be controlled by merchants, creditors, and others hostile to the interests of ordinary Americans. They believed that only a small republic could succeed, not an expansive republic, as Madison had argued. Liberty was the watchword of the Anti-Federalists, and they charged that the Constitution did not protect individual rights, such as trial by jury or freedom of speech in the press, as did the state constitution. Pro-Constitution politics prevailed in cities and rural areas integrated into the commercial marketplace. Its strongest supporters were men of great wealth, but the promise of prosperity had also appealed to urban artisans, laborers, and sailors who thought a stronger central government would revive a lagging economy. Anti-federalism found most of its support in rural and frontier areas populated by struggling farmers. Ultimately, the pro-constitutionalist energy, organization, and command of the press prevailed. Madison won support for the Constitution by promising that the first Congress would enact a Bill of Rights. Although many people in Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia opposed the document, only Rhode Island and North Carolina voted against ratification. The individual rights that are today protected by the Constitution and celebrated by Americans were not actually in the original document that was ratified in 1788. Madison promised that Congress would pass this Bill of Rights in order to gain support for ratification, but he believed that this was kind of redundant. It would not prevent majorities from violating constitutional rights in the future. Each new state, however, had a Bill of Rights. So Madison presented a series of amendments that became the basis for the Bill of Rights ratified by the states in 1791. They included the First Amendment, which prohibited Congress from legislating on religion and protecting freedom of the press and assembly. The second, which upholded the right to bear arms and organize militias, and other amendments affirming the right to trial by jury and prohibiting abuses such as arrest without warrants and forcing a person accused of a crime to testify against himself. The Ninth declared that rights not specifically mentioned in the Constitution were in fact retained by the people, which opened the door to establish new rights not articulated in the text. The 10th Amendment affirmed that powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states were then reserved to the states, which protected them against encroaching federal power. The Bill of Rights showed how the Revolution changed America. Most remarkably, the Constitution recognized religious freedom. The Constitution, unlike the Declaration of Independence, is entirely secular. It does not refer to God, and it bars religious tests for federal officers. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from legislating on religious matters, as a departure from colonial and British precedent. You see here, this is an engraving and a poem that was published in 1788 in an American newspaper after New York became the 11th state to ratify the new Constitution. North Carolina would eventually ratify in 1789 and Rhode Island in 1790. You see here on the map shows those who were which colonies or areas of the 13 states, colonies, I apologize, that were Federalists, Anti-Federalists, evenly divided, or politically unorganized. Now, in this last section, We the People, we're going to be looking at how the definition of citizenship really excluded Native Americans and African Americans. Colonial Americans had been divided by ethnicity, religion, class, and status, and were only united by their allegiance to Great Britain. The Revolution created a new collective body, the American people, whose members were to enjoy the freedom as members of a new political community. Since government in the United States rested on the will of the people, establishing the identity of the people was important. The Constitution begins with We the People, but this people did not include all who were living within the United States. The Constitution identified three groups in the United States: Indians, who were treated as members of independent tribes and not part of the American nation; other persons, or slaves; and the people, which were the only group entitled to freedom in America. America at first seemed to offer civic identity to all who had dedicated themselves to America's political principles, but only certain groups of people were deemed citizens in the new nation. You can see here on a medal that was issued to Red Jacket, a Seneca chief during his visit to Philadelphia in 1792. It depicts George Washington offering an Indian a peace pipe. This agricultural scene in the background was intended to suggest that Indians should take up farming. This is the signing of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. In this treaty, a group of tribes ceded or gave up control most of the area on the current state of Ohio, along with the site that became the city of Chicago, to the United States. The way that the early republic related to Indians and African Americans shows the contradictory principles shaping American national identity. American leaders agreed that Western Indian land should go to white Americans, but disagreed about which option was best for dealing with the Indian population: removal, disappearance, or assimilation into white civilization. Many Americans thought that Indians were unfit for citizenship. Indian tribes were not represented in this new government, and the treaty system gave them the unique status of independent sovereign nations. But treaties, often signed by only a few who were unrepresented members of a tribe, were essentially a means of transferring Indian land to the state or federal government. Military conflict in the Old Northwest continued until 1794, when a U.S. victory led to the Treaty of Greenville the next year. This gave most of the Ohio and Indiana to the U.S. government and established a system whereby tribes received annual grants of money at the cost of government interference in tribal affairs. Now, not all Americans believed that Indians were innately inferior to white Americans. Some, like Thomas Jefferson, believed that they lived at a less advanced stage of civilization. In the 1790s, the federal government distributed agricultural tools and livestock to Indians in order to encourage them to adopt American ways of life. You can see in this map, by 1790, the Indian population had declined significantly from the earlier colonial era, but the area west of the Appalachian Mountains was still known as Indian country. The status of free blacks in the early republic was very ambiguous. The Constitution did not initially define who are citizens of the United States, so individual states defined those boundaries of freedom for themselves. In some states, North and South, free blacks had some rights, which included the right to vote, but the vast majority of blacks were enslaved, and slaves were not considered members of the nation or fully eligible for citizenship if they were free. Early immigration policies show that Americans excluded blacks from their conception of who was an American. The Naturalization Act, passed by Congress in 1790, first defined American nationality by allowing only free white persons to emigrate and become citizens. Although some believe that this law initiated an open immigration policy, the word white in the law excluded the majority of mankind from coming to America and becoming citizens. You can see here in this chart the total population and the black population of the United States in 1790, comparing that of slaves and free blacks and the total population. This is a young African American in the late 1770s, painted by John Singleton Copley. He was known for his portraits of prominent Americans in Britain, and this subject probably worked on a New England fishing boat. And this is what's interesting and notable about this is one of the era's very few portraits of a black person. John Locke had argued that liberty flowed from a man having the power of reason. It did not seem a contradiction at the time to deny liberty to irrational beings. Increasingly, white Americans saw blacks as lacking the qualities that enabled freedom, self-control, reason, and allegiance to a larger community. Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia published in 1785, claimed that blacks, because of their nature and experience of slavery, were disloyal to America. He speculated that they were inherently inferior to whites. Now, while he believed that Indians might have the capacity to become as civilized as whites, he did not believe the same for blacks. He did not think they naturally had this ability. Now, while hoping for the end of slavery and opposing the slave trade, he also supported colonization, or the idea that blacks, once freed from slavery, could never fully be part of America and should be colonized in Africa or other parts of the Western Hemisphere. In his ambivalent approach to race and slavery, Jefferson was really reflecting the thinking of his generation. So in his notes on the state of Virginia, we can see not just Jefferson's opinion on slavery and race, but really the opinion of many in his generation.